Well, greetings and welcome to Church and Society's 2023 Justice Talk series. I'm Reverend Laura Kigweba-James. I serve as the Director of Grassroots Organizing at the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. And today I will be your moderator and for our discussion on legislative priorities and engaging our 118th United States Congress. Before introducing my colleagues and panelists for our conversation today, I have a few housekeeping items as you all enter into this virtual space. So for questions, please use our Q&A box. Towards the end of our webinar today, we will try our best to answer as many questions as possible. Today's conversation will be recorded, and a follow-up email with links to resources and the recording will be sent to all registered participants after our webinar today. And lastly, I want to thank our engagement coordinator, Amber Gaines, our director of communications, Jeff, and senior communications specialist, James, for coordinating and developing this series. Thank you all so much. And now let me introduce my esteemed colleagues and our panelists for today. Please welcome the Interim General Secretary, John Hill. If you want to wave hello. Our Director of Economics, Health, and Gender, Reverend Camille Henderson-Edwards. Welcome, Camille. Director of Peace with Justice, Holly Metcalf. Welcome. And our Director of Civil and Human Rights, Kendall McBroom. So welcome to you all, and thank you for your presence. So globally, we are all hearing and experiencing the impacts of climate injustice, systemic healthcare inequities, the violation of care and dignity of immigrants and migrants, increased poverty and challenges towards peace. Yet amid all of this, God is calling us as the church to respond. So grounded in scripture and tradition, informed by reason and experience, our United Methodist social teachings and principles equip us as the church to respond to these realities with a just and equitable vision for our communities and world. But what does this vision look like? And in 2023, how can we engage in collective organizing and advocacy to move towards this vision? So John, I want to direct this first question to you about why does Church and Society set issue priorities and how do these priorities inform our work? Welcome.
Sure, thanks Laura, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. I wanted to take a minute just to also thank everyone who has joined us in our advocacy efforts over the past year. We had just a tremendous level of engagement with both Congress and the administration and can celebrate some real significant progress on our priorities. We'll be talking about that throughout the session, from peace to climate, from health to immigration. Your advocacy has had a clear impact. We had over 16,000 messages that were delivered last year. And I want to assure you that those messages do make a difference. We often get that question, like, does my advocacy matter? On issues like climate justice and gun violence prevention, we saw a movement for the first time in many, many years, in large part because elected officials were hearing from their constituents. They were hearing from you demanding change, demanding action in the face of ongoing violence, in the face of ongoing injustice. So I just wanted to take a moment to celebrate that as we talk about our work for the coming year. And I also wanted to sort of note that we are doing this work in the midst of a time of transition and some uncertainty, particularly within the United Methodist Church, right? So organizationally, I know we all want to thank Susan Henry Crow for her leadership as General Secretary. She retired at the end of last year, really after a lifetime dedicated to ministry within the United Methodist Church, and wish her every blessing on her retirement. I'm humbled to step into this role as Interim General Secretary and do that knowing that we have such an immensely talented, gifted, faithful, and really joyful staff that many of whom are on the call today. And so just grateful for that and look for us to really be engaged significantly this year. We're not in a holding pattern. We're doing our work in the midst of transition. And then of course, you know, within the United Methodist Church, we do have ongoing uncertainty as we lead into General Conference next year. But for us, in the midst of this uncertainty, in the midst of this transition, the one thing we know for certain is that the voice of United Methodists for justice and peace is as important as ever. You know, in the face of war, in the warming planet, in the face of ongoing gun violence, communities that are being impacted daily by gun violence, the exploitation, dehumanization of immigrants and migrants. We have voices who are given platforms to openly espouse and embolden white supremacy and transphobia, anti-Semitism. Our work, our mission, really our voice as a United Methodist Church is as vital as ever. So with that kind of as the backdrop of where we are in this moment, I'm excited about this conversation today about the priorities that we're still focused on. As Laura mentioned, our priorities are all tied to the official positions of the United Methodist Church, the social principles, the Book of Resolutions, and Church and Society is continuing to focus on 5 key areas that we'll talk about: climate, health, migration and immigration, peace and poverty. And each of those priorities we approach with a particular attention to their intersection with racial justice. We've already communicated these priorities to the 118th Congress in a letter both of welcome and of kind of fervent prayer that members really focus on people over partisanship and that they work together to find some common ground for the common good. So while Congress is still getting organized, there are committee assignments still being made, staff still being hired. We want to make sure that they immediately know what our priorities are and that we are already strategizing as a staff with our grassroots United Methodist connections, with our ecumenical and interfaith partners and broader coalitions about how we might move forward these priorities in the 118th Congress. 2023 actually marks my 30th year working in Washington, DC. From a variety of different perspectives, engaging in policy. And the one thing I've learned is that we can't always predict what it is that's going to move in Congress or what event might happen that might be a catalyst for action. But we do know is that we have to really do the work now in conversation, connected with our elected officials to make sure they understand our priorities. So whatever the piece of, whatever legislative vehicle might be moving, there's talk about the debt ceiling, there's talk about the Farm Bill, talk about, almost assuredly an end of year appropriations package. We will have done the work and prepared sort of the deep understanding of Congress on these issues, impress upon elected officials the kind of moral case for action, and then connect those policies to the lives of people in our community so that, like last year with gun violence and climate, inaction is no longer an option, right? So that's the kind of energy we want to bring to this 118th Congress in this time of transition. So that's kind of a brief overview of the moment we find ourselves in, the naming of the 5 priorities. And I know we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each of them and give you ideas about how we see this moving forward in this year. So Laura, I'll turn it back to you as we get into the deeper dive into our priorities.
Thank you, John. And yeah, let's move forward with the same energy. And I also want to acknowledge that the chat is moving. Continue to introduce yourselves as we engage this conversation, as well as a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A box. So to unpack our priorities, I want to move it over to Reverend Henderson-Edwards around health. We are still experiencing a global pandemic that has revealed historic and systemic disparities across the board that John named. And so just really curious around what legislative priorities related to healthcare that we need to engage in the 118th Congress. And I'll pass it to you.
Yes, thank you, Reverend James. One, hello to all who are gathered. It's so wonderful to see everyone listing their names and where they're coming from. And I'm just loving the engagement and being able to connect in this realm. Within this priority of health, at first, I think I'd like to start by naming some of the guiding social principles that I use that people, as we work in community, those social principles that we're guided by. So within this context of health, I depend a lot on paragraph 162V, which notes the right to healthcare and lists things, one of which that, this role of creating the personal and social conditions in which health and people can thrive is a joint responsibility that is both public and private. One that we say, and I'm sure that you all hear often, is that we affirm that healthcare is a basic human right. And when we talk about healthcare, we're talking not just about a service provided, but ensuring that that service that is provided is equitable, that it is of high quality, and that is comprehensive and available for all people. So that is sort of like the grounding and the foundation that I stand on, that all of you stand on as we advocate for issues of healthcare. And so a high level, sort of like a few things to highlight in terms of some of our priorities for health. One is, of course, Reverend James, as you have stated, we are still very much in a pandemic. So focus around COVID-19 and vaccine equity will continue to be an area of focus for us. So in partnership with coalition partners, last year, we submitted a letter to Congress outlining sort of remaining priorities for healthcare. And in that letter, we called on the U.S. to, one, continue funding and increase funding for COVID-19, both within the U.S. and then also supporting greater contributions to build stronger public health systems globally. We know that while our response to COVID-19 has progressed since 2020, when this first started, the virus still poses a significant threat. So we, are now dealing with the effects of long COVID. And funding for these things in support of making sure that people are protected because of this virus would support things like free rapid tests, as we have, had in the past, PPE, and then also continued treatments for people who needed as a result of contracting the virus. And then also funding would support the government's ability to raise awareness. We now have bivalent boosters, the government's ability to monitor cases and to conduct research into new vaccines and treatments. So we want to make sure that those things that we have done in the past, we're able to continue to do. We say vaccine equity, we want to make sure that we're highlighting distribution equity, because as we've seen throughout the pandemic, is that low-income communities are oftentimes the last to receive both information and treatment. And so we want to make sure that we are making sure that the things that we need to be able to care for ourselves, that's provided to communities who are oftentimes either marginalized or forgotten about in terms of making sure that those resources are provided. So that's the legislative focus and some of the things that we've been focusing on last year. Moving forward to 2023, I think it's important to also note that our legislative focus translates to the church. I've been thinking a lot about some of the experiences I've had last year in talking with faith communities who have come to visit, or we've had virtual conversations. And the question has always been, how do we disciple people into doing this work, right? Like, how does this translate to us who are in the local church wanting to do legislative advocacy while also making this a part of the life of the church? I think as it relates to COVID-19 and the vaccine equity and legislative advocacy that we'll do around that, one thing that I have seen, I was in the local church when this first started and now transitioned to church and society. During that time when I was in the local church, the churches were trusted sources for the community. Right. So when we went through the process of shutting down and having to figure out what worship looked like and how to continue the various Bible studies and things of that nature, we were able to share information about how to care for oneself. So many churches ran vaccine drives and were able to get needed vaccines to people in the communities that they served. And I do believe that in addition to the legislative advocacy that we will do in terms of action alerts and making sure that we're building relationships with our members of Congress and representatives, that we continue to be that trusted source in the community, especially around providing information about the benefits of making sure that the communities are properly vaccinated, that they're boosted, and making sure that we're continuing to have that conversation about the benefits of vaccines. So COVID vaccine equity is one thing that I'd like to highlight. Another thing that I'd like to highlight is our focus around maternal and reproductive health care. And so there are two major things. Legislatively, we have been monitoring and advocating for passage around maternal mortality. There is an act, the Black Maternal Health Omnibus Act. So this is a package of about 12 bills that address the maternal health crisis. We have been talking at length about the crisis for a couple of months now. And so the issue of maternal mortality, one, this is not an issue that is specific to the United States. The issue of maternal mortality is a global issue. It deserves noting that the United States holds the highest rate of maternal mortality among industrialized nations. And within that context, right, if we are to employ this lens of racial justice, then we must consider the reality that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die due to pregnancy-related causes than white women, right? And so this is due to things like racial bias, inadequate access to resources in the medical field, and also the access to resources and comprehensive health care was further sort of exacerbated, right, this past summer by the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so the focus becomes making sure that people who are making decisions about their healthcare, about their maternal and reproductive healthcare, have the resources that they need to make informed decisions. So in addition to monitoring and advocating for the Black Maternal Health Omnibus Act, we'll also be focusing on some of the federal protections and focusing to restore those federal protections for birthing people to be able to access reproductive health care, right? So women might be able to access care for their bodies in the best way that both they and their physicians and their communities see fit. That's what we've been focusing on in the previous year. I think moving forward and also translating this to the church is that this also is an act of justice and discipleship. That what I was surprised by, and I think some of the most meaningful work that I did last year was taking the time to visit churches, to have conversations about how we as United Methodists show up in this conversation, right, on maternal and reproductive health. There was a time, and most of those conversations came at the invitation of the churches, that pastors were looking to hold conversations and just needed a little bit of guidance in terms of what the social principles say, but then also how to have this somewhat pastoral response to what was happening. An example that I'll use was Reverend Tom Berlin, who is now an Episcopal leader, but during his time at Florence United Methodist Church in the Virginia Annual Conference, they had a time to call the community together where myself and a number of other pastors and leaders had the space to contend with the complexities of where the church stands. And if you read the social principle statement, it is very nuanced, and there's a lot there. And there's a lot to be internalized, read, interrogated, and understood. And so I think that moving forward, the church's role will be to continue to join in the advocacy for the legislative focus areas that we've listed, and then to continue to create spaces like that of Florence UMC for people to be able to have conversation, so that our conversation around these issues are not simply polarized, but we are understanding the nuances of that issue.
Reverend Henderson-Edwards, thank you so much for the breadth and understanding around healthcare as our priority and the ways that it connects both here in the US and globally, but also the specific call as a church to justice and discipleship and the examples of that. Thank you so much. Wanting to continue to unpack our priorities, we're going to move on to climate. And so John, and we can be in conversation together on this. Last year, there was a full kind of array of ups in terms of recognizing the historical passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. But there are, as Reverend Henderson-Edwards named, continued gaps in terms of access and care around climate justice, even with the Inflation Reduction Act. So just wanting for you to speak on what are the legislative priorities for climate that we will be focused on that will center the work of frontline communities advocating for climate justice.
Yeah, and we should be in conversation about this because you and I have both been working on climate for the past few years. And I think the one thing to name is that we are in a very different position in 2023 because of things that happened in 2022. Again, celebrating not just the advocacy last year, it was years of advocacy that led to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, like everything that goes through this congressional ringer over here, is far from perfect. But it does take steps to reduce our emissions in line with our commitment under the US commitment of the Paris Agreement. And the concerns, right, that we'll be focused on this year are in terms of the implementation is access for the resources. A lot of those resources were in the form of tax credits, which don't do a lot of good to folks who don't have tax liability. And so folks, because they're not refundable, right, you're certainly disproportionately impacting certain communities, particularly communities of color. And so there are issues around implementation, and then also issues around the permitting and build out of the infrastructure necessary for a transition to a clean, green economy. So significant steps made, lots of work yet to be done. The other thing to name that changed significantly last year was at the end of the year at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, the world community, including the US, agreed to establish a mechanism to fund less wealthy countries who were facing irreparable harm, loss and damage from the ongoing climate crisis. And the US had long resisted that, and the global community reached consensus. That was great. The challenge is the US contributed nothing to that, right? At the end of the year in our appropriations, in the US appropriations process, there was no financing given for this international mechanism. And so for us this year, we have a lot of work to do to build support for the US contributing its fair share to the global climate crisis. And that again is impacting communities, frontline communities around the world who are least resourced to address the changes and sometimes the losses and damages that are a result of the climate crisis. So in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act implementation, and I will just give a shout out, I know some of the folks are on the call today, we have an amazing grassroots group of United Methodist Creation Justice Movement advocates who are an amazing resource for the denomination, who always inspire me in their commitment to climate justice and action. And so we were just in conversation even today talking about how to develop some principles as at the federal level, at the state level, we think about what it means to permit projects, what communities are participating in that process, so that we don't just quickly build out an infrastructure that would do continued harm to certain communities. And so whose voices are a part of that conversation? How can we as United Methodists ensure those voices, how can we accompany those voices through this process? And so grateful for their work, and we'll certainly be resourcing that. The other thing to name that is kind of across all of the environmental justice portfolio is the administration's commitment to something called the Justice 40 initiative, which is ensuring that no less than 40% of benefits of federal programs flow to communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. So I think there's another lever for us to really lean into within the administration in terms of making sure that the resources are flowing to frontline communities. So those are the two pieces that we kind of celebrate from last year that continue to inform our advocacy this year. Certainly building support and that moral call for the US to pay its fair share is going to be a heavy lift for this Congress, and one that may take a few cycles to really generate outcomes, but that's something that we're particularly focused on this year.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the reminder around grassroots voices that are both in the UMC, but also deeply informed the loss and damage action that happened at COP27. And so when we think about it is accompaniment, and it's also our voices when we speak to our members of Congress, when we speak to our leaders that deeply inform action around climate. And so thank you for naming that and really kind of calling us to task to continue to use our voices to build power so that we can create a change that addresses the climate crisis today. So thank you. So wanting to continue to unpack our priorities, wanting to focus on immigration and global migration. So Kendall, the question that I have for you is, as people of faith, we love the sojourner in our midst. It is our call scripturally by affirming the value, worth, and dignity of all people, regardless of their legal status or nationality. However, from last year to this year in the US and abroad, there are policies that do not affirm the value, worth, and dignity of immigrants and migrants. So what priorities related to immigrant and migrant justice are we going to be focusing on? What does it look like in this upcoming Congress to value the worth and dignity of the immigrant, the migrant? Kendall.
Thank you, Reverend James, for the question. And again, so good to see so many online and so many participating with this. I want to echo or start off in a way that my colleague, Reverend Henderson-Edwards, started as far as what grounds the priority and what grounds the actions that we take. And so also looking at paragraph 162, letter H, the rights of immigrants, where it was stated in the question that we affirm the dignity, value, and worth, regardless of citizenship status, regardless of nation of origin. And so getting that, into the hearts and the minds of both the members of Congress, but even within our own church, that individuals would understand that at the core, at the root of this priority, at the root of our advocacy work, is that immigrants and migrants are worthy of the dignity that is bestowed upon them by the Creator and by God, and that in that we've been called to ensure their protection, their safety, and their security. And so last year, we advocated for inclusive and a just pathway towards citizenship. This work took place alongside our coalition partners in the Interfaith Coalition and communities of immigrants throughout the U.S., calling essentially for a sense of security. As we know, DACA was up to be ripped apart, and with that, that left a lot of individuals, a lot of communities in limbo. And I don't know about you that are listening online or if you've ever been in that liminal space, that limbo space, it's not a good feeling. So we want to advocate and ensure for a sense of security with a pathway to citizenship. And in the 118th, and we also were advocating against the enshrinement of Title 42, which was a very harmful policy of the previous administration, but was continued or was looking to be continued in the current administration. And so in the 118th, what are we doing? We are looking to continue this advocacy work as far as a pathway to citizenship, as well as fight back against attempts to pit immigrant communities against one another. So there are attempts to ensure that if we give security to one group of immigrants, we might not have to give it to another group. And that's just not the case. If we're going to do it, we're advocating and looking for this Congress not to pit these groups against each other, but find a way to work together, to find a way to ensure security for those that are most vulnerable and most marginalized, and pushing back against the current asylum ban that the administration is seeking to implement. Also advocating against practices that do harm toward the migrant and immigrant families. And so what does that look like? That looks like essentially taking these social principles and going back to where we were rooted in paragraph 162 and letter H, and sharing that with both communities on the ground and grassroots organizations and other organizations that are doing this work for as far as advocacy goes for immigrant communities and migrant communities, but also to our members of Congress and their staffers. One of the things that stood out to me in last year as we were advocating for a particular representative to not support a bill because it went against the tenets of our faith, the staffer was actually United Methodist, but did not know about the social principles. But upon learning about it, came into contact with an awareness, I'll call it, that made them rethink what they should do, what their position was on this particular policy. So that is a giant hope that of this year that more of Congress would become aware of where the United Methodist Church stands as it relates to the issues and our priorities. Furthermore, as we witnessed in the opening of this Congress, we are challenged by the gridlock and infighting, but we are hopeful that not only can we share these social principles and can we advocate from this position, ensuring that those who are in the immigrant community have a sense of security. That is really what this call for citizenship for all is about. It's about a sense of security and value and ensuring that the dignity of these individuals is not taken for granted. But hopefully by informing them on these social principles and teachings of the church, that they would not only come to know them, but it would impact and transform the policies and legislation produced. So those are our priorities, and that's what we're hopeful for. That's what we're hopeful about as it relates to immigration, that something can happen to provide a sense of security for those that are in the immigrant and migrant community.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you for that reminder that Reverend Henderson-Edwards that you named earlier about this call to justice and discipleship, knowing that, yes, it's for us, but it's also for members of Congress, right? That there are United Methodists who work in Congress, you know, whether they're staff or representatives or senators, that we need to connect with, and that we are all on this journey towards figuring out what security and safety, you know, I am a daughter of immigrants, right? This is our collective story that we're advocating for collectively. So thank you for naming that. So Holly, I want to turn over to you around peace. You know, peace is the undercurrent to many of the issues that we have talked about so far in specifically, let me get that word out, specifically when it comes to immigration and migrants, the reality of what happened in Afghanistan last year, what is currently happening in Ukraine. So can you speak around peace and what are our legislative priorities related to peace? Yeah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Laura. I want to say first that I'm really enjoying seeing everybody chime in the chat about where they're from, and special shout out to Bennettsville, South Carolina, which is a tiny town where my mom grew up. It's great to see you guys represented here. So I'm going to talk about our priorities this year, but I want to be clear that this is not the only things that we work on related to peace. I'm going to try to give you the highlights. But I also want to mention that if there's other issues you want to follow up on, please feel free to contact us. My email address is on the website under my bio. You're welcome to reach out to me or reach out to anyone on our staff. So on our peace work, our work on peace building is really rooted in our belief as United Methodists that human values should outweigh national claims, military claims when we're looking at priorities. And so what this looks like in reality, especially in Washington, D.C., is that we often spend time trying to keep the U.S. defense budget in check. As you probably know, the United States spends alarming amounts of our national resources on the military. And this is money that could be used for domestic programs, for supporting global health, for international climate finance programs, for humanitarian development assistance. And so that is some of what we do in our peace building work. And if you go in and read our United Methodist social principles, they provide a strong theological foundation for a position of full disarmament and a rejection of war as an instrument of foreign policy. But they also acknowledge that in reality, we live in a violent world, and that sometimes that poses ethical struggles for Christians. And so I would encourage you to go through and read those principles to really consider how your faith informs the way you live in the world. And then no matter where you find yourself theologically, I would say it's undeniable that the United States government regularly allocates funding beyond even what is requested by defense and policy experts for our military. So for example, the budget that was passed last year in December for 2023 included $45 billion more than what the Pentagon requested. So part of our work here in DC is to continue to engage with Congress on this issue, especially as we're starting to look towards the fiscal year 2024 budget process that's going to be starting soon. And so I want to ask folks that are listening on the call to please go to our website, use the action alert that we have there on military spending to contact your congressperson, because when you're able to send those from your district, it helps to reinforce the work that we're doing here in Washington. Another major focus that I want to talk about today for 2023 is our work to end gun violence. And as John mentioned before, we have been so encouraged by the response we've seen from United Methodists on this issue. And so we're continuing to work on the gun violence issue, both domestically and globally. Our faith compels us to protect the sanctity of human life. And we are called to reject this culture of fear and self-protection that is fueling a cycle of violence. We have had 40 mass shootings in this country in 2023. 40 mass shootings. And today's the 25th day of the year. And mass shootings are not the leading cause of gun deaths in America. Suicide by firearm is the most common, followed by homicides, meaning that those 40 mass shootings are just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond these horrific statistics about victims of gun violence, I think if you talk to any parent or teacher in America, they can tell you about the emotional toll that this culture of constant fear is having on our society. And the good news for us in this situation is that we know how to solve the problem. We have evidence-based proposals in a range of different areas. We have examples from other countries that have had success on this issue. And we have examples from laws that were previously on the books in America that were successful and that have expired. And so there's plenty of work to be done on this issue, which means that there's plenty of ways to be engaged on this issue in ways that feel comfortable and appropriate to you. So anything from safe storage laws to renewing the assault weapons ban, to ensuring that we close loopholes on background checks. This is an issue that for people of faith should really cut across the partisan divide. So I attended a workshop last December, and they invited a panel of emergency room doctors to speak to us about their experiences with gun violence. And unanimously, every single person on that panel emphasize the fact that gun violence victims are often impossible to save once they've been shot, whereas victims of violence of any other kind often have high chances of survival. They made it clear to us that while restricting access to guns may not prevent suicide attempts or domestic violence or criminal activity, it would absolutely have an impact on their ability as medical professionals to give these individuals a second chance at life. I should mention here that the United States is also the largest exporter of firearms worldwide. So when you see crime statistics for gun deaths in Canada, Mexico, Thailand, the Philippines, those guns were often manufactured in the United States according to US laws and regulations. So the laws that we pass here in Washington, DC for this country affect people's lives worldwide. So that's another issue where we're continuing our advocacy efforts. We saw last summer great success with the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and that was due to the ways that people across the country got engaged on this issue. And we saw so much wonderful involvement from United Methodists, and we are so thankful for that. There's an action alert on our website that you can send on this issue as well. We also have resources on the website for small group leaders, for pastors about this issue. I'm also meeting regularly with United Methodists that want to get more engaged about this, and I would welcome an opportunity to meet more of you guys. So I know we're short on time. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Reverend Laura, and I'm happy to take more questions later.
Holly, thank you so much for calling us to task and really giving the breadth to when we talk about peace, when we talk about conflict, that it truly is right here at home, and how our relationship to guns, both in distribution and holding, impacts not just in the US, but globally. And thank you. So Reverend Henderson-Edwards, I want to turn it back over to you around our priority when it comes to poverty. So as United Methodists, we have this bold vision of peace that Holly just named, and of flourishing that advocates for economic justice and against poverty. So what legislative priorities are we focused on in this upcoming Congress that affirms our collective vision for economic justice? And I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Yeah. So again, a guiding social principle, I think, is in the economic community, paragraph 163. There are, which mentions that, we recognize and support a number of things, such as revising tax structures and governmental programs to ensure that we are supporting and advocating on behalf of the poor. Also, the economic community in paragraph 163 affirms that we see, or part of our resolutions is that, we identify national budgets as moral documents. And we're affirming that, these budgets should reflect our work in investing, life-giving priorities. And so sort of to connect the work that we've done last year into next year, a lot of focus was around in the previous months around the child tax credit, right? Expanding the child tax credit, which was an example of making sure that, or for us advocating to make sure that people have what they need. So a little history around the child tax credit. Because of the pandemic, there were certain stipulations that had been shifted so that parents and families could support their children, could buy groceries, do all those things. And so that version of the child tax credit expired in 2021. And so we were actively advocating for it to be returned in its expanded form. We were not successful in doing that, but we will continue to advocate for such measures. And I think last year, Reverend James, participating in things like Witness Wednesday with Reverend Alicia Gordon of the Current Project. And I think that that was such an important moment to not only highlight the policy, but to make sure that we understand that the policies that we're advocating for are connected to people. And that those policies, we have to have a comprehensive understanding of its benefit. Right. So the children that we're advocating for in that context of Wednesday Witness, we lifted up that a lot of Black single mothers would be affected by the benefits that were provided by the child tax credit, the expanded child tax credit. And so making sure that we are opening our lenses, opening our scope to the full community. So moving forward to 2023, along the lines of ensuring that budgets as moral documents are prioritizing the needs of the poor. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard in the news, conversations about, the United States breaching the debt ceiling and everyone trying to figure out what that looks like and what that means. I think part of our advocacy work is to ensure that while Congress and the federal government is having conversations and negotiations about a solution to that, we must make sure that the resources that support the poor, that those are not cut, that we're still able to maintain social safety nets and the things that have been developed so that people are able to, for example, eat, right? Making sure that our food programs and things of that nature are supported. So monitoring the process, the budgeting process, and also making sure that we're having a conversation with our leaders to ensure that those social safety nets are supported. I think that flows into an example and another sort of legislative focus for this year, which is the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill, it is up for reauthorization this year. It expires. It was enacted in I believe December of 2018, right, and comes up for reauthorization every 5 years. And so the bill itself is another package of, many different pieces of legislation that covers a number of things. But as it relates to economic justice in my portfolio, in particular, there's this issue of nutrition, right? So this bill supports things like SNAP, right, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and the Emergency Food Assistance Program. So making sure, again, that we are caring for low-income communities. And so while the process will be doing a lot of work with our coalitions here to ensure that we're building strategy and creating a narrative within our advocacy that supports its reauthorization, and the contents of it will be working as a collective to make sure that that happens. I do think that in addition to the action alerts and other public forms of advocacy that will come along with things like supporting the Farm Bill, again, translating the advocacy work to the church and how it fits within the context of the life of the church, I think we're also to add sort of like this layer of examining how our current ministries are informing things like these. So I think, for example, like people, we always, churches have ministries like food pantries, and making sure that there are food drives generally around the holidays to make sure that people have food and are able to nourish themselves. What I am learning, what I have seen since being in this position is that what is needed when we have conversations with staffers and of different congressional offices are the everyday experiences of people on the ground, right? So I think also what is beneficial, what would it look like to have church leaders come together to give witness to what they see through their service for food pantry ministries, right? And connecting that to this larger conversation that we're having around food insecurity. And then also ensuring that we are having this conversation about going further upstream to ensure that issues like food insecurity, right, that we are providing both a direct service in terms of making sure that food is provided through such programs, but then also turning around to ask the question of how this came about to begin with, right, and making sure that our conversations are comprehensive in that way. So yeah, I think those are in terms of economic justice, high level things to highlight for this upcoming year.
Thank you, Reverend Henderson-Edwards, again, for the breadth of what we talk about when we have this vision of economic justice and how we can call it to task and engage. So thank you. So I don't think anyone can leave this conversation today without taking action. And the resources are available. Holly said, yes, if you go directly to our website and you scroll down, there is literally a button that says take action, and it will show you all the actions that we have named today. And so I encourage each of you, if we can maybe drop our website into the chat, Amber, to go directly to that website and reach out to your member of Congress, because there is just such a breadth of what needs to be addressed. And, you know, our legislative priorities are putting our social principles and teachings into action. And as United Methodists on this call, you can engage these priorities by reaching out to your members of Congress, by calling them directly, or again, heading to our action page. So I think we have a time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. I know we've received several, which is incredible. And just trying to figure out, just give me a quick second around where shall we begin? Legislators. Okay. I'm going to go for just the top question, and this is to you, Holly. So the question comes from Reverend Rich Peacock. Thank you. Will the GBCS be advocating for the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and asking members of Congress to take the ICAN pledge? I'm writing a resolution for the 2024 General Conference. So any words on that?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I am so thrilled to hear that folks are working on this issue out there. Yes, we continue to advocate for nuclear disarmament, including for the U.S. to sign on to and embrace the principles in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I had a meeting last week with the Back from the Brink campaign, which is one of the groups working on nuclear abolition that we work closely with and have endorsed the work of. And so in that meeting, I gathered with lots of other faith groups that are interested in doing nuclear advocacy work this year. And we were talking through the best ways to strategize and prioritize with the new Congress on that issue. So I'm happy to take more detailed questions via email, but yes, absolutely. And thank you for your work.
Thank you, Holly. Reverend Henderson-Edwards, this question is for you. Are there any legislative advocacy efforts to address the 30+ million Americans without health insurance and to shore up the ACA?
Yeah, so we did, I know when I first got here, did a lot of work around Medicaid expansion. And we were hopeful that, you know, it would be included in some of this spending measures that Congress negotiated last year. That was not the case. What we will focus on, as you know, there are, I believe, 12 states who still have not adopted Medicaid, and working at the state level, focusing at the state level to see if we can build political power and strategy to expand Medicaid in those states.
Thank you, Reverend Henderson-Edwards. Okay. And another question for you, Reverend Henderson-Edwards, just around, you spoke to this earlier in terms of the United Methodist Church's stance around reproductive health. And so just curious about if you could speak more to, as you said, the nuance of our statement and what it covers. This question comes around, does UMC have a formal position on the right to life? So just if you want to speak to
that. Yeah, so, sorry, were you?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. So yeah, so if you go to the social principles, we have a statement on abortion. The statement is not, it's not a simple statement. It's not a brief statement. It recognizes that we do not approach this issue lightly. That we as the United Methodist Church, right, we are not monolithic. That the role of the writers of this statement, they took in the many beliefs and values reflective of the United Methodist Church. So if you read it, you'll see that the nuance is that there is reluctance in going I'll say there is sensitivity when talking about the sanctity of life, right? And how we as Christians have this theological and moral sort of grounding in making sure that life that was created by the divine is honored and valued. It also then goes to say that there are times when I believe the verbiage is tragic life conflicts with life, right? So we know, and if we are to follow theologically, right, this presence of evil, right, we are in a broken world. And there are sometimes things that happen that we do not have answers or responses to, right? That is by way of us living in this broken world. And so you'll see in the statement that it is contending, right, with our moral responsibility to honor and value the life that has been created by the divine, that we do in co-creation with the divine. And also to recognize that there are things that happen that we cannot anticipate or explain. And so with those two, I guess, sort of elements coexisting, you'll see that the statement itself is nuanced in that way. So I encourage you to read it in its entirety. I think you'll find that, again, there is grace in the statement, as we should exercise grace with ourselves and each other. So again, very nuanced. It aims to be comprehensive, and ultimately it gives space and room for people to be able to do what they feel is best for themselves.
Thank you, Reverend Henderson-Edwards, for your response to such a such a powerful and very delicate reality for many. So thank you for naming that. So we are towards the end of our time. Again, thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues and panelists, for Holly, Kendall, Reverend Henderson-Edwards, General Secretary, Interim General Secretary John Hill, as well as Amber and Jeff and James. Thank you all for making this happen. Just a reminder, you can connect with Church and Society, whether it is the Take Action page, connect with us through the website to reach out to us as staff. Please know that our Faith and Fact cards have been updated. And just one thing I'll ask in the chat, if you're a Church and Society chair, can you just say hi and let us know who you are? Church and Society chair, Peace with Justice chairs, please recognize yourselves in the chat. Our work cannot happen without you all. So really grateful for your leadership at the annual conference level. And for those of you on the call, really hope that you are connecting with and being resourced by your Church and Society chairs and Peace with Justice chairs as well. There's also working group meetings. Holly mentioned on gun violence prevention. There's another working group around criminal justice. Also, if you are doing direct work, whether that is advocacy as well as direct service around immigration, refugee, asylum, there is a rapid response team, and you can connect with Kendall or myself for more information on that. And so there are many ways to get connected into the vision of justice that we are proclaiming as a church to live into for 2023 and for our future. And you can connect through the Church and Society website or just reaching out to each of us directly. And as a reminder, a follow-up email with today's recording, as well as resources, will be going out to everyone who's registered on the call today. So thank you all for joining us. Yes, I see all of the Church and Society chairs, Nevada City, Grass Valley, California, wonderful. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with each of you soon. Blessings.